They still speak of the man in the lowlands where the cypress trees bow toward the dark water, a whisper of a figure whose name was never written down in the plantation ledgers. No baptisms recorded, no sales receipts preserved, no trace in the brittle archives that survived fire and war. A man who lived without letters and vanished without footprints, remembered only through the quiver that passed through a room whenever someone swore they had seen him. He was called many things over the years, each name shifting like the mist that clung to the marshes: the shadow of the canebrake, the Moor of blood, the wandering bondman. Names layered by fear and rumor, yet none carried the shape of the man himself. The story begins, as such stories do, with a land built on cruelty and a season steeped in suffering. The plantations along the Carolina coast moved like machines of hunger, swallowing the lives of the enslaved and spitting out rice and indigo and fortunes for the men who never touched the mud. The air was thick with the buzz of mosquitoes and the cries of overseers, and in that heat families were split like bundles of hemp. New shipments replaced the broken bodies of those who fell. It was a world meant to grind a person down until identity dissolved into obedience. Yet there was one who did not break. He arrived with a group of captives whose wrists still showed the fresh rawness of the Middle Passage chains. The others staggered with that hollow-eyed look of those who had crossed an ocean in darkness. But he stood upright, watching everything with a stillness that unsettled the traders. He was tall, broader in the shoulders than most, with a quietness that resisted interpretation. The auction block creaked under his weight, and some remembered the way the plantation buyers avoided his gaze, as if something in the depth of his eyes announced that he was not suited for the fields, nor for the lash, nor for the world they wanted to shove him into. The records do not say where he was placed, because the plantation that purchased him burned down years later. But the story survives through the mouths of those who worked the land. They remembered the day the first overseer disappeared. A man known for his whip and his vulgar laugh, found face down in the swamp with his throat cut cleanly, as if by a blade that no one remembered issuing to any man in bondage. The owners blamed bandits, then a panther, then rival planters with a grudge. Anything, anyone, except a slave. The idea that one of their own could strike in the night and slip past patrols was something they refused to consider. But when the second man vanished, and the third and the fourth followed within a single season, even the hardened slave catchers began to mutter. When a cluster of rice planters were found dead near the edge of a canebrake, their bodies laid out as though someone wanted them found, the story changed shape. Fear traveled faster than the river runoff, carrying whispers to every porch and every patrol wagon. A single figure moving through the swamplands like a phantom, striking at men who thought themselves untouchable. Some claimed he was a warrior before he was captured, a man trained from childhood in ways the slavers could not understand. Others insisted he had made a pact with old spirits of the African coast, and that the marshes hide him because the land itself wanted revenge. Those who believed in nothing supernatural argued he had simply learned the terrain, mastered survival, and used the night as his ally. But none could explain how one man could move from plantation to plantation, leaving bodies without ever being glimpsed by the night watch. The enslaved whispered of him with a mixture of awe and dread. For some, he was a symbol of resistance, proof that bondage did not kill every flame inside the human spirit. For others, he represented a danger that could bring harsher reprisals upon everyone. The world they lived in punished any hint of rebellion with collective vengeance. The lash did not discriminate when it hunted for someone to blame. The owners responded with patrols thick as locust swarms. Lanterns flickered along the riverbanks. Muskets gleamed in the arms of men who had never before known fear. Dogs were brought from distant cities, lean brutes trained to track the scent of enslaved runaways. They were set loose into the night with men shouting commands, hoping to rouse a trail, to find some scrap of cloth, some print in the mud. But the marshland drank all evidence. Prints dissolved into water. Dogs returned, whining, confused. No one could find a trace. Each death spread the legend wider. Some counted a dozen, others swore 50. The most terrified among them claimed a number near 200, though no one could confirm it. Fear inflated everything in those days, and the frontier between fact and folklore was thin like a reed. But the number did not matter. What mattered was the realization that the systems of control, the chains, the whips, the dogs, the guns, the courts, the men who believed themselves masters, were not unbreakable. The killings continued for years, and each time the pattern repeated. A body found in some isolated place, the throat opened, the face twisted in a final moment of disbelief. Whatever tool he used, it struck with precision. Some insisted it was a blade he forged himself. Others believed he used the very cane stalks sharpened by the swamp's natural decay. No one could point to a weapon, because no weapon was ever left behind. The landowners sent word to the cities. Militias were formed. Rewards were posted, amounts so great they could have bought a year's harvest. Men from as far as Virginia rode in, confident their rifles and bravado would bring the fugitive down. But the marshlands were not their domain. They were swallowed by mud, bitten by insects, disoriented by the tangle of trees. Some never returned. The man became a myth before he even vanished. It is said his final act unfolded during a storm that carved the sky open with forked lightning, the kind of night when the clouds felt too close to the earth. A plantation owner, notorious for cruelty, was found slumped over his porch rail at dawn, blood trailing from his collar to the floorboards. The dogs refused to approach the body. The patrol searched for tracks, but the rain had washed away everything, leaving only the copper smell in the air and the sinking suspicion that the killer had passed within arm's reach of their own beds. After that night, the killings stopped. Not slowed, not dwindled, stopped. As if the earth had swallowed the man whole. People searched for him for years. Some believed he died in the marshes, claimed by a wound no one had seen inflicted. Others imagined he slipped northward, crossing forests and mountains until he reached some hidden refuge. A few believed he boarded a ship and returned across the ocean to the homeland he had never meant to leave. But the oldest voices in the lowlands whispered something different. The marsh, they said, keeps what it chooses. And sometimes it keeps secrets, not bodies. The legend endured because no one ever found his remains, his possessions, or even a hint of his path. Only a silence that stretched through the generations, a silence heavy enough to keep the story alive. The lowlands never forget. The moss remembers the weight of every footstep. The river remembers every body lowered into its current, and the old cypress roots remember the tremors of men who once thought themselves unshakable. Long after the killing ceased, the land still carried an unease that locals felt whenever twilight settled over the marshes. The story of the vanished slave became less a tale of blood and more a tale of consequences woven into the soil. A reminder that no cruelty goes unanswered forever. Years passed, then decades. The plantations changed owners as fortunes rose and fell. Yet the legend persisted in hushed tones. Patrolmen grew old and confessed their fears to younger men, telling them to keep wide circles around the canebrake where the bodies had been found, warning that the place held a memory all its own. Some claimed the reeds still swayed on windless days, bending toward a path that no human foot had pressed for years. Others believed the shadows beneath the trees thickened unnaturally at dusk, as if gathering around an unseen presence. Children of the enslaved listened to their elders tell the story not as encouragement but as caution. The man had struck a blow against the system that bound them, but the reprisals that followed had scorched whole communities. Patrols tightened, punishments grew harsher, families lived under greater suspicion. The legend was a double-edged blade. Hope mingled with fear, resistance tangled with pain. Yet the story endured because it spoke to something deeper, something older than the plantations, the refusal of the human spirit to bow completely. Decades after the last killing, a traveler arrived from the north, a scholar with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that kept slipping down his nose. He had heard whispers of the tale in distant taverns and wanted to uncover the truth behind the legend. He wandered the lowlands with notebooks tucked under his arm, interviewing anyone willing to talk. Most dismissed him with wary eyes. Outsiders weren't trusted with stories that ran this deep. But there were always a few who couldn't resist the pull of memory. An elderly woman who had spent her life in bondage before being freed recalled the first time she heard of the killer. She had been a child, hiding behind a pile of drying rice stalks, listening to adults speak in hushed tones. She couldn't understand everything, but she remembered the fear in their voices, the way their hands trembled even as they spoke of a man who walked through danger as though guided by an unseen hand. She remembered the flicker of hope that sparked in their eyes as they imagined a world in which their suffering had an avenger somewhere in the shadows. That hope had cost them dearly in the end, but it had also carried them through nights when the whip cracked too close. Another man, stooped with age and nearly blind, claimed he had seen the fugitive once. The scholar leaned close as the old man described a figure emerging from the mist near the riverbank, tall and silent, the muscles in his back rippling beneath the scars left by shackles. He moved with a purpose that made the old man freeze in place. The stranger didn't look dangerous, he said, just determined. Determined in a way that made the world around him seem fragile. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, swallowed by the reeds as if the marsh had opened its jaws. The scholar filled notebook after notebook with accounts, but the more he uncovered, the less certain he became. Every story contradicted the last. Some said the man acted alone. Others believed he had a network of allies hidden across the plantations. A few insisted he had never existed, that the string of deaths had been exaggerated by fear or attributed to a convenient phantom. But in every version, the marsh played a role, a boundary, a refuge, a keeper of secrets. Determined to uncover something tangible, the scholar hired a guide to take him deep into the canebrake, farther than any patrol had dared go in recent memory. The guide was a man who knew the land better than he knew his own reflection. He led the scholar through narrow paths where the reeds towered overhead like prison walls. The air grew thick, weighted with the scent of damp earth and the hum of unseen insects. Each step stirred memories in the mud, as if the ground recognized the disturbance. They reached a clearing near a pool of water so still it reflected the sky like polished obsidian. The guide refused to step closer, claiming the place wasn't meant for the living. The scholar, unburdened by superstition, waded forward. The mud sucked at his boots. His eyes scanned the ground for any sign, a shard of metal, a scrap of cloth, a disturbed patch of soil. He found nothing. Yet something unsettled him. The silence here was unnatural. Even the insects held their breath. The reeds stood motionless, though the air should have stirred them. It felt as if the marsh itself was watching, waiting to see if this outsider would dare disturb the secrecy it had guarded for so long. The scholar dipped his hand into the dark water. The surface rippled, distorting his reflection until it vanished. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw another shape in its place. Broad shoulders, a steady gaze, the ghost of a man who belonged more to myth than history. He jerked backward, heart pounding. The image dissolved instantly. When he looked again, the pool showed nothing but sky and reeds. He returned to the guide, pale and shaken. Together they retreated through the marsh, the silence trailing behind them like a shadow. Back in town, the scholar confessed his experience to the elderly woman who had spoken with him earlier. She listened, her face unreadable. When he finished, she nodded slowly, as though something he had described fit a pattern she had long understood. She reminded him that legends don't survive because they are true or false. They survive because they carry something people need. Some truths live in documents and archives, she said. Others live in places that refuse to give them up. In the end, the scholar left the lowlands with more questions than answers. His notebooks held stories, contradictions, and insights, but nothing definitive. The legend remained what it had always been, a boundary between history and folklore, shaped by fear, hope, and the land's own refusal to surrender its secrets. Yet, long after he departed, people swore the marshlands changed again. The clearing where the scholar had dipped his hand grew denser, as if the reeds had closed ranks to protect what lay beneath. Hunters avoided the area, and even the birds flew wide circles around it. Some insisted the man's spirit lingered there, not as a vengeful presence, but a guardian. Others believed he was never a spirit at all, only a memory preserved by a land that had witnessed too much suffering to remain silent. And as the years crept forward, the legend continued to move through the lowlands like the slow drift of fog, impossible to grasp, yet impossible to dismiss. It remains a reminder that even the darkest places can hold defiance, that even the most brutal systems can be shaken, and that the truth behind a legend can be more powerful than the legend itself. The marshlands entered a new century, but time moved slowly there, drifting like pollen over the water. The world beyond the lowlands changed. Empires fell, new nations rose, and the plantations that once ruled the coastline crumbled under the weight of war and decay. Yet the legend endured as stubbornly as the roots of the cypress trees, carried into new generations by those who felt the past pressing against their shoulders. The marsh remembered, and in ways no one fully understood, it waited. After the scholar's departure, the clearing he had visited became a point of quiet fascination and deeper fear. People rarely went near it, but stories continued to collect around it like leaves gathering in a still corner of a pond. Some swore the reeds grew taller there than anywhere else, thick enough to block out the sun when the wind passed over them. Others believed the air around the clearing stayed cooler, as if touched by a presence just beyond sight. Whatever lived in that place, memory or spirit, was something the lowlands did not question. Years later, when the rice fields were long abandoned and nature swallowed the remnants of old plantations, a young woman named Ada wandered the marsh with a determination that set her apart from others her age. Her grandmother had raised her on stories of the vanished man, not as a warning, but as a thread connecting her to ancestors who had lived and died within the reach of those same waters. Ada came to the marsh not with fear, but with reverence, seeking to understand the world they had survived. She carried no weapon, no lantern, only a small satchel of herbs and a notebook she used to trace the stories her grandmother whispered on humid nights. The old woman had passed months earlier, leaving Ada with a promise that the marsh would speak if she learned how to listen. So she returned again and again, breathing the thick air, letting her feet sink into the mud, feeling for something beneath the surface. Most in the town thought her strange, a young woman wandering a place where few dared step. But Ada felt drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. Something in the marsh resonated with her, echoing through her ribs like the last notes of a forgotten song. One evening, just before dusk, she followed a deer path lined with reeds so tall they seemed to form an archway. The air felt heavier with each step. Sunlight dimmed until only thin gold slivers filtered through the stalks. The path opened onto the pool the scholar had written about decades earlier. Ada froze at the sight of it. The clearing felt untouched by time. The water still reflected the sky like obsidian glass. The reeds around it leaned inward, creating a circle as if guarding the stillness at its center. Ada stepped forward, barely breathing. She knelt at the pool's edge and brushed her fingertips across the surface. The water trembled, rippling outward in perfect rings. Her reflection wavered and deepened, dark shapes swirling beneath her own features. For a moment, she felt as though another presence hovered just behind her shoulder. Not threatening, not even mournful, simply waiting. Her grandmother had spoken of him not as a killer, but as a man pushed past the boundaries of what a human spirit could withstand. A man shaped by chains and cruelty until something inside him splintered and forged itself anew. The deaths that followed were a part of the land's story, but the legend wasn't about blood. It was about resistance that could not be erased, even when the world tried to bury it. Ada felt the truth of that now, humming through her bones as she stared into the water. A breeze stirred the reeds, soft at first, then stronger. The tops bent like hands reaching toward her. She closed her eyes, letting the air press against her skin, carrying the scent of earth and old sorrow. When she opened them again, the sky reflected in the pool had changed. A faint silhouette emerged behind her reflection. Tall, motionless, familiar from 100 whispered descriptions. A broad shadow, shoulders shaped by labor, eyes carved from endurance. Ada didn't flinch. The silhouette didn't move. It hung there as if the marsh itself had painted it across the water. She lowered her head, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. Whatever remained of him was not flesh or spirit in the way stories imagined. It was memory thickened into the soil, resistance embedded in the roots, a presence forged by the land's refusal to forget. She realized then that nothing haunted this place, not a ghost, not a monster, only a truth so powerful the marsh had claimed it as its own. The silhouette slowly dissolved as the ripples faded. The water returned to its mirror-still surface. Ada stood and lifted her notebook, pressing a palm against its worn cover. She didn't need to write what she had seen. Some knowledge didn't belong to paper. Some stories live best in the quiet places where they could breathe. When she turned to leave the clearing, the reeds parted gently as if clearing a path. The air felt lighter than before. The marsh had released something, or perhaps entrusted it to her. By the time Ada returned to town, dusk had settled. Porch lanterns flickered to life, casting halos across the dirt road. People called her name, asking where she had been, but she only smiled softly and walked past them, feeling a calm certainty unfurl within her. The legend of the vanished man would not end with fear or speculation. It would end in understanding, held by those who approach the past not to exploit it, but to honor it. In the years that followed, Ada carried the story carefully, sharing it with those who sought history rather than myth. She spoke of the man not as a ghost or a phantom, but as a symbol of endurance shaped by the land itself. A reminder that even in the darkest conditions, defiance could take root, and that some truths lived beyond names, beyond records, beyond death. Eventually, Ada grew old, her voice softer, her steps slower. Before she passed, she returned to the marsh one final time. Those who found her there said she looked peaceful, seated beside the still pool with her eyes half closed, as if listening to something just beneath the water's surface. The marsh, they whispered, had welcomed her. And with her passing, the legend shifted once more, not as fear, but as memory, deep, ancient, and unbroken. The land remembers. It always has, and it always will.